everyone, this is Sam Black with Drafting Archetypes, and today I'm going to be discussing red-white in Tarkir Dragonstorm. As always, the notes are available to follow along at patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. I personally have not been off to a great start win rate-wise in this format, and so rather than trying to tell you what I've been doing, which is not necessarily advisable, while I work out the best ways to approach the strategies that I've been implementing, I figured it would be best to start with what has been working for other people from the data, looking at both untapped and 17 lands. And what I've found is that red-white is the most drafted and most successful color pair. Notably, as a color pair, it is less drafted by quite a bit than any of the color trios, but also performs better than they do. This is always a bit of a complicated subject to parse, the relative comparisons of 2-color decks to 3-color decks, because I think I've talked about this before. The more open any color that you're in is, the less likely you are to play more colors, because you just keep getting past good cards in that color, and you generally want to take cards of colors you already have more than you want to take cards of another color. And so if you happen to be the only red drafter at a table, then you're not very likely to draft very many colors that aren't red, and you are likely to see a lot of good red cards because no one's taking them from you. So, in general, when a deck has fewer colors, that means that the person who was drafting it is a beneficiary of an open seat. So it's not necessarily fair to, after the fact, compare the success of decks with fewer colors in aggregate to decks with more colors in aggregate. That's to say that it's hard to know whether you should try to be 2-color or 3-color in any given draft based on the relative overall success of 2- and 3-color decks. But when people have been in a seat such that they ended up red-white, it has gone well for them. So I wanted to look at how and why and what has to happen to make those decks good. Well, successful red-white decks look like conventional aggro decks. Few 1-drops, a lot of 2-drops, and fewer expensive cards. People have often played 16 lands in their red-white decks that earned trophies, and I would guess that many people don't really consider whether or not they should cut the 17th land. So when I see a lot of people having success early in a format with 16 lands, it makes me think maybe even more people should be playing 16 lands. So we're looking at, the land light, low curve, very conventional aggro decks, and I talked about how the set design of this format discourages that. There aren't a lot of cheap, aggressive creatures with a good amount of power, but it is possible to find them. In particular, the uncommon 2/1 that Descendant of Storms. 1 white, 2/1. When it attacks, you can spend 1 and a white to endure. That kind of breaks the soft rule set by the rest of the set about not having like a good ratio of power to casting cost in creatures that are available in limited. But if you happen to draft 2 of those or whatever, then you can have these like curve out starts that look like your any other format with a red-white aggro deck. And because most decks in this format can't do that, most of your opponents won't be prepared for it because they won't be incentivized to, because most of their opponents are doing something else. Most of their opponents are playing bigger creatures later in the game that demand different kinds of answers, and decks will succeed based on their access to like counter spells and card advantage and trumps for big creatures and expensive bombs and stuff that just doesn't necessarily line up well against a streamlined aggro deck. Also, because there are more good expensive cards and good expensive creatures and fewer good cheap creatures, many of your opponents will be designing their decks in such a way that they kind of naturally fall behind in the first couple turns, and then they intend to play big creatures that block your creatures to stabilize. That plan is naturally not well positioned against going wide, and going wide is what Mobilize does. Also, the plan of playing a big creature to invalidate multiple small attackers is vulnerable to the aggressive opponent simply killing the big creature and then attacking with the creatures that are on board. Or better yet for the aggro deck, doing that in a mana efficient way while continuing to increase the number of creatures they have in play. If you think about two aggro decks playing against each other, where both of them have a lot of 1 and 2 mana creatures, having a 2 or 3 mana removal spell is not an asset in that matchup, because your little creatures are just trading, and the removal spell is going to trade down on mana and therefore basically down on tempo. And you'd be better off just playing another big creature and trading off your small creatures. But when none of your opponents are doing that, and you always have smaller creatures and then they play a bigger creature, and then you can use a removal spell on that bigger creature, and that will be their only blocker, and then all your little creatures can attack. Now your removal spells are pushing damage and maintaining your tempo advantage. So in this format, where your opponent's generally playing from behind, removal is more valuable in an aggro deck than it is in most formats. So these red-white aggro decks, a lot of the time that I personally draft an aggro deck, I'm going to prioritize above rate creatures over removal spells. This set structure encourages me to worry less about whether my creature is half a point more efficient and worry more about making sure that I have answers to the creatures that my opponent plays that try to block my creatures. So that means that you're looking for commons like Stormplane Detainment, the common Oblivion Ring, Coordinated Maneuver, the instant that does damage equal to the number of creatures you control or destroys an enchantment. This card, incidentally, plays really well in this format because Mobilize means that you tend to have more creatures in play for a little while when you need it to resolve this spell than you would with creatures that don't have Mobilize. And if you compare this to like the Aether Drift equivalent, it's an instant red and a sorcery, and instants are just a lot better. Also, Osseous and Molten Exhale, the red and white removal spells that get better when you reveal dragons. All of these cards are commons that perform well, that are good at dealing with blockers to let you keep making attacks. The best common creatures that you're looking for are Reigning Victor, the Mardu 3/3 that makes something indestructible and +1 power when it attacks, or +1 power this turn and has Mobilize 1. That performs very well even in 2-color Boros, where presumably sometimes you'll have like a splash land or a Devotee that'll let you play it for 3 mana, but playing it for 4 mana is really just fine. Shock Brigade, the 1/3 reach Mobilize 1 for 1 and a red, and Salt Road Pack Beast, the 5 and a white 4/3 that costs 1 less for each creature you control and draws a card when it enters. So like basically Mobilize plays really well. Salt Road Pack Beast is very good. You're looking for, that stuff plus Mardu Devotee, and really just any aggressive looking 2-drop will get the job done pretty much fine. And then you want to just pair those with the Mobilize that you can find, the rewards for going wide that you can find, removal, combat tricks, and you want to just make sure that you are ready to clear the defensive creatures that your opponent's trying to play. So when I say you are looking to draft as removal, that leads to a question of, okay, so what's the balance? How many creatures am I supposed to play? So that was something that I looked at in terms of just looking over trophy winning decks and seeing how many creatures they played. And I would say it looks like you probably want like 16 creatures, 16 lands, and then that leaves you with 8 other things. That's probably going to be like, 4 to 6 removal spells, 0 to 4 combat tricks, and then maybe a couple of like enchantments and monuments and whatever else you have. But I think, 16 is a good number of creatures. Like you're going to draw multiple of them. You're going to be able to put enough pressure on your opponent. You're not likely to draw, combat tricks and no guys to target them with or whatever, while still allowing, plenty of room to have a good amount of removal to keep the board clear for your attackers. Another thing that I noticed is that this archetype is really not reliant on rares. Most of the trophy decks that I looked at contained 2 rares, like a vast majority had exactly 2. A few had more, many had less. Even the decks that went 7-0 that I saw were all just like 2 rares. The strength of this deck, I often talk about how when you have like a really good bomb, that incentivizes you to draft a control deck so you play longer games, see more cards, find that really good bomb. Whereas in the condensed games that you play with aggro decks, doesn't matter as much what your best card is, and matters more that you have, all the right tools, a good curve. How good your worst cards is kind of matters more than how good your best card is. And so having, an extra rare or whatever isn't going to be the thing that makes or breaks how good your deck is. It's more the time in a draft, like your seeding, when your red-white deck is going to be the best, is when red-white is open and other players aren't contesting the commons that you want, rather than when you open the best red or white rares. So that means that this deck is relatively, consistently available or repeatable because you don't need those rare spikes. It is, as I mentioned at the beginning, the most commonly drafted 2-color pair. So there will be times when, the cards are just contested. But overall, I think that this is a very attainable deck. Also, I want to note that I do expect the win rate for this archetype to drop off a little bit or to normalize. And I don't think that will happen primarily because of more people drafting it and the cards becoming more contested. I think that it will happen primarily from other people learning how to draft the slower decks with more resilience against these aggro decks, as they see that these aggro decks are performing well and need to be respected. And you can't just play, all stuff that's good against, dragons and other big decks. That you need to make sure that you have, a core that's going to keep you alive against these Boros and Mardu decks. So, for example, I personally find Humbling Elder, the blue 1/2 with flash that gives something -2 power when it enters, a very effective tool to stabilize against the aggro decks. It doesn't have great stats overall. It's not the best against the slower decks, but I think that it gives you so much equity against the aggro decks that I think that it's often worth playing anyway. And that's just one example. I'm not saying, specifically this is all going to change because everyone's going to start main decking all their Humbling Elders and Boros is just never going to beat a Humbling Elder. I'm just saying people will learn what sacrifices they can afford to make and that they need to make some sacrifices to be better positioned against the red-white decks. And I think that people will do that, and the red-white decks will be a little bit less successful once, they're playing against more prepared opponents. That said, I do think that, the fundamentals here, like the fact that, yes, everyone is going to be playing a higher curve than you are, and you do have relatively hard removal that's going to answer their bigger creatures pretty efficiently, and you are really good at going wide, and the one blocker per turn plan is not good against the going wide quickly plan. So there are a lot of structural advantages. I don't think this is going to suddenly become a bad deck. I just think that while it's currently the top performing by quite a bit, I think that will normalize some as people build their decks differently. So, pretty, kind of straightforward stuff. Like we're looking at just, a conventional aggro deck. Kind of the major notes here are mobilize is real. You do want to prioritize the cards that have it and the cards that take advantage of these tokens or that pump all your guys. While Boros is the best performing 2-color deck, Boros with a splash is not the best performing 2-color with a splash deck. You need to be very careful about stretching your mana and playing tapped lands because you are fundamentally an aggro deck, and if you have a bunch of tapped lands and mana where you sometimes can't cast your splash spells or even sometimes, are missing one of your base colors because you drew a splash color land instead, that's going to hurt you a lot. I always talk about how the more controlling you are, the more colors you can get away with playing. This is a deck where you really want to be straight 2 or 2 with a light splash, and if you're trying to splash, you really want to prioritize stuff like Mardu Devotee that lets you hit your splash colors while developing your board without needing to play tapped lands. So you really want to, understand that you're drafting an aggro deck and think about what that means in terms of being responsible with your mana base and making sure that you're going to be able to curve out. I do want to turn this over to Twitch chat. So, I've mostly said my piece here. So first, I want to thank the newest patron at patreon.com/draftingarchetypes, Luna. Thank you very much for the support. I really appreciate it. If anyone else is looking to contribute to the podcast, again, be sure to check out patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. Now I'm going to be fielding questions from Twitch chat. So any questions that you have about this archetype or comments about your experience with the archetype, this is still pretty new to me. We're, like a day-ish into the set. I would be happy to talk about it. So, what bombs would you consider splashing? I don't have an exhaustive list of bombs that I would consider splashing. I would consider anything that seems powerful and on plan, especially, like the deck that I just drafted that felt pretty good. I splashed Zergo and the uncommon dragon that deals 2 to something and gains 2, and makes your opponent discard if you shocked them. And that felt like a reasonably efficient and responsible splash. Obviously, you don't want to splash things that cost 2 colored pips, and you want to make sure that, if you're splashing cards, they are really worth the trouble and that you can support them without, disrupting the core functionality of your deck too much. Usually white removal like Osseous Breath that kills a blocker after blocks aren't preferred in aggressive decks. Do you think it plays better here than usual because of Mobilize, or is it the efficiency of hitting 5 toughness? I think that Mobilize definitely helps with it, and I also think that it is still true that it's worse than, other removal, but because you're so wide and you're mostly just like attacking with things that have like 1 power, the relevant question is how much damage are you giving up because your opponent got to block first? And since you're not attacking with like 3/1s and then your opponent's blocking and you use the removal spell and you miss, 3 damage, or like, if you were attacking with a single big creature, your opponent blocks it, you use a removal spell, you push no damage that turn. You're attacking with like a bunch of 1/1s, your opponent blocks one of them, you give up 1 damage, that doesn't really matter. So yeah, usually that kind of removal spell would be a pretty bad fit for an aggro deck, but it's very efficient here. It's a little bit, it's somewhere between being like a combat trick and a removal spell. In a way, worst of both worlds in some cases, but not in all. But I think, since it's like 2 mana hard removal, it's like good enough to get the job done. Hard, not exactly, but 5 is going to kill most things. What's the best way to get into red white? Start with white removal and then move in if cheap common creatures are available? The last draft, I just started with the common 1/2 Endure 1 because I just wanted to draft it. I think that, exactly right now, while it's early and people haven't really adapted, I think that it's not unreasonable to just kind of force it. Assuming, like, obviously, if there's some great card, you should probably take a great card over some, common for red white. But I think that it's not unreasonable to just like bias toward, I'd like to end up here, I'm just going to take, the good commons for this deck. If that's not what you're doing, then, whatever card is good enough to like get you into it. And then it's like, really, I think that the way to get into white red is to prioritize being white red over finding a 3-color combination that includes white red. So like, it's less how do you start in this lane and more do you want to recognize that you should stay in this lane instead of like, okay, I have white and red cards, let's find out if I'm Mardu or Jeskai. I think that you want to, acknowledge that maybe you're not supposed to be Mardu or Jeskai. Maybe you're just supposed to do what you can to stay red-white. Are the trophy decks you're looking at for best of 1, best of 3, or both? If both, are there noticeable differences between the formats, like land count or overall performance? I think I was looking at best of 1. I didn't like study or compare in that much detail. And yes, the sample sizes are tiny. Do you predict creatures with Endure will become more valuable as a way to counter Boros decks? That's an interesting question, since, right, as you point out, it's like the reason for this question is because I mentioned that just playing 1 creature per turn doesn't line up well against the removal spells, and it's hard to double spell. But if you can play a creature with Endure and choose to make another creature, now you have more resistance to their plan of like go wide, play a removal spell, because you can add 2 creatures to the board. That's an interesting question. I'm not sure. The Endure creatures generally don't read great to me, but I also think that they might play better than they read. So I would say that that's something to think about or look for. I'm not sure. Are there any good off-ramps if you start red-white and then get cut? Well, yes. There are 2 different, 3-color combinations that include red-white that you can easily pivot into. I would recommend pivoting into Mardu or Jeskai if red-white is insufficiently open to be a straight red-white deck. Would you run any lands from third color to cast tri-cards like Reigning Victor or Monastery Messenger? Yes. I mean, especially if you have like a monument or whatever, having one off-color basic, if you have some of those cards, is totally fine. Again, I think the devotees are like the ideal way to make that happen, but having like an off-color basic that you can find, or having, a few tapped lands or whatever, if you have some of that stuff, or if you, are splashing, generally won't hurt you that much. You just don't want to go crazy with tapped lands. Since most of the deck is commons and there aren't gold cards that work there, do you think this type of deck is possible in other Red X pairings? Interesting question. Obviously, since, we're using Mobilize to go wide, the most obvious place to do it would be if you were to try red-black. Red-blue would be the other natural option, since that's where, like, that's a color that the set intends you to pair red with. I do think that there is a way to build aggressive red-blue, but I think that it, leans less on Mobilize. As far as, like, red-black aggro, I'd say I'm skeptical. I think that you can still splash the Mardu stuff, but it just feels more dangerous to draft. And I feel like white has better payoffs for going wide than black does. You want, the like pack beast, and you want like the, coordinated maneuver that, like, white has a bunch of, tricks that like scale with going wide. You're losing access to frontline rush. I'm skeptical of actively pursuing like red-black aggro. I think, like, yeah, I think that in general you want to stick to enemy color pairs for your two-color decks, and I think that red-blue can be an aggro deck, but saying more than that seems like a conversation for another podcast. Feelings on Delcovian Pack Beast, the 04 Vigilance Mobilized 3. Not a ton of experience, but, on paper, like, my expectation is that it's probably quite good if you have a lot of, dedicated mobilized payoffs, and not very good if you don't. The more your card is all about this high mobilized number, the more it's like, well, yeah, this is going to be incredible if you go Shocking Sharpshooter into the war enchantment thing that gives all your creatures plus 1/0. Like, your opponent's, going to be in really rough shape against that curve. Whereas if you're just playing it, as a totally normal creature, then, it's basically like a 3/4 that your opponent can just like double block and kill without losing anything. So I'd say you really want to be sure that you're like leaning into the synergies with that one. Also, it's probably pretty good to have combat tricks with that, since your opponent's going to think that they can block it freely, and being able to like pump the 04 and kill the things that are blocking it is probably going to go well for you. Especially, of course, Frontline Rush, since it scales so well with the Mobilize 3. Would you run Mardu Monument in a straight two-color deck? No. I would play the other off-color land so that I could find that and then activate the Mardu Monument, because I think the three haste menace creatures are very strong. Like, I would only play, like, if I had Mardu Monument in a red-white deck, I would play a Swamp. And I would only do that if I had other black cards. At least like some Reigning Victors or something. Is War Effort the ideal curve topper at lower rarity? It makes sense to me as a good curve topper at lower rarity. I don't know for sure that it's the ideal one. Does this imply that stuff like the Green Exhale are worse versus red-white? Well, the Green Exhale seems obviously worse than the other exhales against red-white, right? Because it doesn't kill a thing on turn 2 where like the other ones do, and you need to stick a creature, which like they're generally trying to stop you from doing. So yes, it does. Looking at all the trophy decks so far, I barely see Rescue Leopards and Seize the Opportunity. Why? Rescue Leopards, I believe, is the 3-mana 4/2, and that doesn't accomplish the plan of like going wide, and gives your opponent the ability to favorably trade with your attacker by, blocking your 3-mana creature with their 2-mana creature. And Seize the Opportunity is just a bit more expensive than you're looking for, especially since you're trying to make sure that your small creatures can attack into creatures that are quite a bit bigger. And the +2/+1 might not be a big enough pump to let you do that. And so you'd rather like spend less mana. Like, your whole thing is that you're trying to punish your opponent for not having as many creatures as you do. So you're kind of like expecting that they only have like one creature at a time. And Seize the Opportunity is better when there are, more involved combats and you're like winning 2 different fights at the same time. And that's not really going to be happening very often. Like, it's pretty unlikely that it's going to simultaneously swing 2 combats. And so at 3 mana, it's less efficient than just playing a 2-mana trick that does what you want it to do, or a removal spell. And the like card draw opportunity that it provides is just not really the thing that you're looking for. I think that I think Leopard is more of a Teamer card structurally, and Seize the Opportunity is more of a Jeskai card structurally. And I think that's going to cover it. So thank you everyone for listening. I am headed to Denver tomorrow as of the time of recording this. So if anyone listening will be in Denver, I imagine many of you will, feel free to say hi if you see me. And I will be back next week with more Dragonstorm coverage. Bye for now.
Prepare for light speed.